Hi, I'm Al Sang, co-founder and CTO here at StrongLoop. Today we're announcing the LoopBack open source gateway, and I'm going to go ahead and do a walkthrough. First, let's define the gateway. The gateway is commonly a very overloaded word. What I mean by an API gateway is that key piece of infrastructure that sits between your clients or the API clients and the API producers, or where you're actually hosting the APIs and the business logic that constitute the APIs. You need somewhat of a buffer, right? You need some sort of firewall, you need some protection against the clients and the producers so that there aren't things like DOS attacks and that kind of thing. So it fulfills a couple of functions, the first of which is key, that most enterprises are concerned about, is security. So who has access to your API endpoints? What type of access? Is it based on roles? Is it based on what the resources are? Is it a combination thereof? Usually it is. The gateway also acts as a sort of data massager, right? So depending on the client, you may have to do some form of mediation between protocols. So if my native API endpoints are, say, all in REST, but my API client is expecting SOAP, sometimes the gateway does a thing called mediation to transform these things over into so that it's client palatable. It also provides quality of service infrastructure capabilities as well. So it'll actually inject information in the form of headers or metadata by which you can capture things like higher level orders of instrumentation, analytics, which leads into the other point, which is overall, it's your source of monitoring. It's your source of reporting on metrics that are captured on your API usage, right? And we try to do this in a light way possible because we don't want to interrupt the injection stream of invocation on the API clients to what they expect from the producers. It also can serve as a form of aggregation, and this is sort of a new generation capability where the clients are asking for some sort of mashup, some sort of dynamic view of your APIs, and a lot of enterprises have taken the approach of a microservices architecture where you have very fine-grained APIs that need to be rolled up into something that the client view, for example, is expecting. So the API gateway sometimes acts as a form of aggregator of APIs so that you get one call versus, say, 6 calls to build the same view representation. Let's go over the overall sort of architecture of what I'm going to go ahead and demo for you today. Again, as I mentioned before, you have a bunch of clients that are going through, say, the internet, and you're hitting up the gateway as your first point of contact. And what the gateway has is a couple of endpoints to do the OAuth flow. So I'll go over the use cases of what our open source gateway will support. But for now, we're going to go ahead and illustrate the OAuth 2 flow as part of the demo representation. So I'm going to go ahead and hit this endpoint. The endpoint is going to ask me to authenticate myself. Once upon providing the credentials, I'm going to provide my username, a secret, and I'm going to get back a token. And that token basically is going to be a bearer token, so it's going to be clear text. It's not going to be encrypted through a key. We do support that through JWT, but that's not part of this demo, just for the sake of illustration. And once I have that token, then I'm going to go and hit the gateway again and say, here's my token. I want to get access to this resource. The gateway is going to say, oh, this token, you're expecting this endpoint, does a match against who I am, my token, to the resource, and says, this person has access. I'm going to go ahead and proxy the request over to the API server or the producer. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the demo portion here. So the first thing I'm going to do, and you've seen me in other videos do this, and I like to repeatedly illustrate this, is I'm going to go ahead and scaffold a LoopBack API app. And as you can see how easy it is to do this, we're going to go ahead and use our Yeoman generator-based API generation tool. Give it a name. So demo API server. It's going to go ahead and do the npm installation for me. Once I'm done, I'm going to go ahead and create a model called a note. So my API server is going to do simply one thing. It's going to serve up notes. My notes are going to have a title, and they're going to have some content. So let's go ahead and do the model generation portion. So LoopBack model note. Let's go ahead and accept the name. I'm going to attach it to my in-memory database. Again, LoopBack comes with an in-memory database so that you can just create APIs on the fly, have them fully mocked up, virtualized, ready to go. And let's give it the model its first property, call it title, make it a string, don't make it required, and then the title is going to be matched with sort of summary information or the detail, and we're going to call that content. Again, making it string. Okay, so I should have now my API server ready to go. Let's go ahead and fire that up. So, oops, let me give it a port assignment. 3002, so I don't conflict with any other running processes. Okay, so here's our API Explorer. Again, I scaffolded an API app, and I have now created a model called Notes, and I'm going to go ahead and post a couple of notes just for illustrative purposes. So let's call this first one, the title, let's call that Note 1, and just as a reminder, I'm going to pick up some milk on the way home, whatever. Same thing. Let's go ahead and do Note 2, and whoops. Let's do wash the car as a reminder. Okay, great. So I've inserted 2 notes through our REST Explorer, API Explorer, and I can go ahead and retrieve those notes, again, hitting our in-memory database, and voila, notes 1 and 2. So I have an API endpoint now called API/notes, and this is the representation that I'm getting back when I hit up API notes, this JSON doc. So now, what I'm going to go ahead and do now, this is the server. I'm going to secure it in a way with the gateway. Okay, so the gateway now is going to act as that, again, intermediary. And what I've done is I've git cloned LoopBack Gateway. You can find this on GitHub under the StrongLoop org. And I'm going to go ahead and run this. And let's just make sure I have that. Yep, that's good. Okay, so the gateway repo has an example client app. Okay, so the client app is going to walk me through hitting that API notes endpoint, but it's going to walk me through the OAuth authentication flow, right? So let me first go to that URL that it spun up. Okay, so this is the client. I'm going to walk through what we call the implicit flow. There's a couple of other flows, and you're more than free to try these out. I'm going to go ahead and request access to this endpoint, and this is what it's affirming. So it's doing a redirection saying, no, I need to get access to this endpoint through the gateway. So it's going to go ahead and redirect to the gateway. And then I'm going to grab in, I'm going to provide my credentials. So Bob secret, this is to tell the gateway, hey, this is me. These are my credentials, right? So it's going to authenticate, and once I authenticate, it's going to say, just like you do in Facebook, it's going to say, hey, there's this client app that's asking for access to your API endpoint called API Notes. Do you want to allow access? And much like in Facebook, right, when it says, do you approve this app, you go ahead and explicitly hit allow. And now I can actually call upon the API that I'm after, and just for illustrative purposes, now I get back exactly what I saw in the API Explorer that was unsecured, right? So this is the flow, the OAuth 2 flow. There are other MVP use cases. So this concludes the demo. I'm going to go back to the slides to talk about a little bit more about the functionality of the gateway. So this is our open source version of the LoopBack Gateway, and it's open source. It serves as our reference implementation. A bunch of you may know that we already have had the gateway within our architectural diagram within the LoopBack framework for quite some time. And that's been on purpose because we've wanted to talk to prospects and customers to really learn about their use cases and do prioritization and to build something that actually makes sense. So what we have is a hardwire, and I'll go into what that means more, but a hardwire version of the MVP use cases that I've listed here. So what you've seen is the OAuth 2 provider side of the flow to secure my API endpoints, my RESTful API endpoints through the OAuth 2 flow. Very common use case. We provide a basic infrastructure for token management, right? So that's the tokens that are issued by the gateway itself. And we're capturing the invocations so that we can actually do some form of metrics. So every time I'm calling the API endpoint, it's saying this user with this resource coming in and asking for this call. And we're capturing how many times, because the last thing that we're doing is we have a basic rate limitation flow where it's basically saying you can do X amount of calls per Y interval, right? And if all that's successful, once we log the invocation, we're then proxying and saying, okay, go ahead and get to the right LB instance that actually has that endpoint. So that's logic that's also built into the gateway. This is, again, the open source version. The StrongLoop gateway is going to be our commercial version of exactly what we built as a reference implementation. So if you are trying to implement an API solution right now and need a gateway, I highly encourage you to take a look at our open source version, because these MVP use cases are going to be re-replicated in the commercial version. The biggest difference, though, is that they won't be hardwired. They're going to be dynamic and modular. And what I mean by that is that each of these use cases that we have for the gateway are going to be composable so that you can be dynamic in being able to specify the level of rate limitation, for example, slice and dice what we call aspects or policies applied to the loopback system. In order to do that, we've had to create two more foundational elements within loopback. The first being components. So the component structure is going to allow us to take Express middleware that already exists, that everyone takes advantage of in Express and is very familiar with, that intercedes with the request of how a request gets served up in Express, wrap that within the component structure in loopback and just plug it in. So we can take advantage of all those great Express middleware components. And policies are going to be your entity to be able to define the what that you want to have access, the constraint or the criteria by which you allow that access, and then finally, what next to call. So your action on being able to chain together policies. And with this sort of structure, we built sort of a modular way to meet all the API use cases, because there's been quite a few that have been named as far as what an API gateway should be. Our sort of vision for an API gateway's next-gen capabilities is to go beyond sort of the static, composable measures that you have within other gateways that you may have seen that are XML-based, GUI, very tightly constrained to just moving around things within a palette, to being able to be scriptable using the power of Node and JavaScript. So what's next? Feel free to download the GitHub repo and that contains the gateway and the tutorial that I just walked through. There's a rate limitation script that you can run through as well, a JWT tutorial as well. And for more information, check out the blog of our announcement of the gateway itself. We have the component and policies in GitHub as part of our wiki for discussion. Make sure we're hitting the points of getting our use case requirements down. And last but not least, feel free to drop by strongloop.com or send us a note at callback@strongloop.com. Thanks for your time.